Please welcome Christopher Benfey.
Well, I've just spent an hour in Sarah's marvelous show, and I have to say, I don't know what you're doing down here in the dark when you could be over there looking at Hokusai's incredible art. The man mad about pain, and what an artist. A dozen years ago, I did publish that book that Sarah referred to called The Great Wave. The Great Wave of the title was meant primarily to be a metaphor. It was a metaphor for what I thought of as the great wave of cultural exchange between Japan and New England during the American Gilded Age. But of course, I also wanted readers to visualize Hokusai's image, the best known image in all Japanese art, and indeed one of the most familiar images in world art. In her interesting new book on this image, Christine Guth calls it a global icon, the great wave off Kanagawa. I remember when my editor at Random House asked me if I had any ideas for a cover illustration for my book. Editors always ask this, and they never take your suggestion. And I allowed us how there was a famous Hokusai image of a great wave, and my editor responded a little huffily, "We don't want the book to look like a t-shirt, for God's sake." So buy the book in order to see what the real cover is. So, if you're going to tell the story of a love affair, it's a good idea to begin at the beginning. I'll be showing just a very few slides, all of them drawn from the Museum of Fine Arts, great collection, mainly to give you something to look at instead of me. Americans like to imagine that first encounter 150 years ago through a veil of legend and myth, a little like a Thanksgiving diorama. On one side is Commodore Matthew Perry of Newport, Rhode Island, with his so-called black ships bristling with modern weaponry. And here is one image of these black ships. On one side, the Americans. On the other side, the Japanese in their wooden boats, armed with swords and oars and ornamental helmets like something out of the Middle Ages. We now know that the Japanese were far more knowledgeable about the West and about Western learning than the Americans thought. We now know that even in those world-shifting weeks of 1853, and again in 1854, when Perry returned to extract a treaty, we know that the Japanese were developing a strategy. It was a strategy that the Japanese writer by adoption, Lafcadio Hearn, referred to as jujutsu. Ju means softness or yielding. The master of jujutsu or judo absorbs the strength of the opponent and uses it against him. The Japanese would open themselves up. They would absorb what the West had to offer. Japan would invite Western experts, many of them from here in New England, to come to Japan and instruct the Japanese in the ways of modern steam power, the ideas of Darwin, and so on. Japan would send Japanese young men and a few young women to learn about Swiss watchmaking in the West, Prussian war making, how to run art museums, and so on. The Japanese would learn how to teach perspective and other tricks of Western art to Japanese children. The Japanese children, in turn, would learn to write with pencils and fountain pens, banishing the traditional brush and black ink from the classroom. In the space of 50 years, and especially during the period from about 1868 to 1904, the period we call the Meiji Era, the whole country was on a crash course in the ways of the modern world. Japan would show off its accomplishments like straight A's on a report card at World's Fairs in Philadelphia, the famous Centennial Exhibition of 1876, at New Orleans, at the Cotton Exposition, at Vienna and Chicago. The Japanese would show off their fire trucks, their medical apparatus, their amazing literacy rates, and so on. But the Japanese quickly discovered that Western audiences had no interest whatsoever in such marvels of modern technology, things that we already had in abundance. Americans and Europeans much preferred an imaginary Japan, what they often referred to as an old Japan, a Japan of fans and porcelain, woodblock prints by Hokusai and Hiroshige, geisha and samurai. Whoops. So if you went to the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, you could buy a cheap souvenir fan like this one with the image of the ships again. If you wanted to spend a lot more money, you could also get a lacquer writing box redolent of old Japan. And then came the final exam in the crash course in modernization in the Western style, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The Japanese victory in this unbelievably brutal lead-up to World War I gave the Japanese a place at the table of modern powers. The childish and timeless little nation had grown up. As the writer for The Nation in New York remarked, quote, "The cherry stone carvers have been preparing all along to hold the trigger." This is a charming German version of the Russo-Japanese War, where you see the nation of taste defeating the Russian barbarians with France on the tail here. And these are the spoils of war, what these countries were fighting for, Korea and so on. Sophisticated Japanese observers were quick to note the ironies. Take Okakura Kakuzo, for example, a brilliant Japanese writer, philosopher, art historian, and for a time, a curator right here at the MFA in Boston, curator of Asian art. According to Okakura, the average Westerner, quote, was accustomed to regard Japan as barbarous while she indulged in the gentle arts of peace. He calls her civilized since she began to commit wholesale slaughter on the Manchurian battlefields. And here we have Japan as she. A wonderful irony there. Barbarians are peaceful, civilized nations make war. And what about that other character in our little diorama, the Americans? During this same period of time, the second half of the 19th century, the United States was on a strangely parallel course of national development. After its little temper tantrum in Edo Bay, when Commodore Perry told the Japanese that in the name of President Millard Fillmore, the Japanese must stop mistreating whaling ships that ran aground on their islands and must let merchant ships refuel, reprovision on the way to Calcutta, and so on. After this temper tantrum, the United States basically lost interest in Japan for 20 years. We all know why. The Americans were distracted. The distraction was the American Civil War. When Commodore Perry returned to the United States after opening Japan, he expected a hero's welcome. Parades in Washington and New York, celebrations at the White House. But no, Commodore Perry was ignored. Washington had other things to think about, like the extension of slavery in the Western territories and threatening noises about secession from Southern senators. Commodore Perry, being a modern man, decided he needed better PR, and he asked his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne if Hawthorne would consider writing a book about the opening of Japan with Perry as hero. I love this idea. Hawthorne was tempted. It sounded like a nice little book concept. As Hawthorne wrote in his journal in December 1854, quote, "It would be a very desirable labor for a young literary man, or for that matter, an old one. For the world can scarcely have in reserve a less hackneyed theme than Japan. But Hawthorne, as I say, had other books on his mind, and he suggested that Perry might ask Herman Melville, who knew something about the Pacific, to write the book instead. Perry, stupidly, decided to write the book himself, and Herman Melville's History of the Opening of Japan is one of the great might-have-beens in American literature. While the United States had its Civil War, the industrial North defeated the feudal and agrarian South and embarked on a period of rapid economic and industrial growth, a period that Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. Mark Twain meant the name ironically, not a golden age, but a merely Gilded Age. Japan, too, had a civil war, culminating in the Satsuma Rebellion of the late 1870s, a war that, as in the U.S., ended with modernizers triumphant and feudal arrangements in shambles. The samurai went the way of the southern planter into the world of movies and popular nostalgia, Gone with the Wind on one side, The Seven Samurai on the other, more recently, The Last Samurai. Of course, we know there will never be a last samurai in the movies. Hokusai's samurai. By the dawn of the 20th century, then, there were two new players on the international stage, two battle-tested young nations in love with modern technology and eager to test the waters of empire. We now know that Japan and the United States were on a collision course. The encroaching black ships off Yokohama would be avenged 100 years later in the destruction of the ships in Pearl Harbor. But such things could hardly have been predicted in 1905, the high point of Gilded Age America's love affair with Japan. Maybe all love affairs have some built-in ironies. We are often dead wrong about what makes us lovable. But this Japanese-American love affair was more ironic than most. Herman Melville, in Moby Dick, called pre-Perry Japan, quote, that double-bolted land. Japan, in fact, had to be opened not once, but twice. Perry did the relatively easy part, forcing Japan to open her major ports to Western ships and Western trade after 200 years of isolation. But there was a second, more significant opening of Japan. This second opening happened much more slowly and asked much more of those doing the opening. And this opening is still going on in exhibitions like the Hokusai extravaganza here at the MFA. It was one thing to fire a few cannonballs across Edo Bay, as the American soldiers did, and run a miniature railroad along the beach to impress the gaping samurai, as the American sailors also did. It was quite another to grasp the tenets of esoteric Buddhism, or to appreciate the frenzied manga of Hokusai, or to understand why the most highly prized vessel in the tea ceremony could be a dun-colored water jar that had buckled in the kiln, or a raku tea bowl that looked like several things had gone very wrong in the making. This second opening of Japan was the work of men and women who realized that Japan had things to offer besides safe harbor for American whaling crews. A sense of urgency impelled these connoisseurs and collectors. They were Darwinians. They knew that their quarry was on the verge of extinction. The irony of my talk tonight, the irony was that just as Bostonians were falling in love with old Japan, Japan was reinventing itself as a modern state. Now, we need to remember that every Western country had its own private Japan. To some extent, this is still the case. In France, for example, where impressionists like Degas and Mary Cassatt discovered the vibrant world of Japanese prints, Japan could seem a pleasure garden for the senses, peopled by two-dimensional geisha and their elegant patrons. In the United States, by contrast, and specifically here in Puritan New England. Is this still Puritan New England? I like to think that it is. Here in New England, I heard a yes. Here in New England, a distinctively different version of old Japan prevailed. In accord with the self-conception that Boston Brahmins held of themselves, this view of Japan was dominated by austere religious practices, martial prowess, and refined taste. T.S. Eliot once said that Boston was refined beyond the point of civilization. From an early period, American collectors of Japanese art conceived of their passion less as a matter of decoration than of spiritual quest, less interior decoration than interior transformation. This is the kind of art that Bostonians favored. Ernest Fenollosa, hired by the Japanese to teach Western philosophy in Tokyo, became the first head of the Japan collection here at the MFA. This is the pattern again: come to teach modern philosophy, fall in love with ancient Japanese and Chinese art. And here at the MFA, Fenollosa persuaded himself that paintings like this one of Kannon, the Japanese deity of compassion, were the spiritual counterpart of Italian Renaissance paintings of angels and the Madonna and Child. You see this sort of floating in the heavens. When Fenollosa hosted the Boston-born historian Henry Adams and the American painter John Lafarge in Japan in 1886, Adams, very excited by French taste, fell in love with Hokusai and wanted to buy a collection of Hokusai's books. Now, Fenollosa considered Japanese prints vulgar. In the case of Hokusai, Fenollosa intoned to Adams, "We miss all that indefinable something which is implied in the word taste. And we hear only the clever talk of the barber and the bartender." I love that. Henry Adams was so appalled by Fenollosa's snootiness that he wrote to his good friend John Hay, "I wish you were here to help us trample on Fenollosa. He has joined a Buddhist sect. I was myself a Buddhist when I left America, but he has converted me to Calvinism with leanings towards the Methodists." So, what is this ironic love affair that I want to talk about? English professors like me love to define their terms, so let's try to define that slippery term, irony. Let's call it, following the dictionary, an incongruity or mismatch between what might be expected and what actually occurs. I think that a fundamental incongruity or mismatch occurred in Japanese-American relations. The idea of an ironic love affair reminds me of a famous Christmas story by the American Gilded Age writer O. Henry called The Gift of the Magi. I'm sure many of you know this story. A husband and wife who are very short of money are determined to give each other handsome Christmas gifts nonetheless. The woman has beautiful long hair. The man has a beautiful gold watch. The woman cuts off her hair, sells it to a wig maker, and uses the money to buy a chain for her husband's watch. The husband, meanwhile, sells his watch to buy tortoiseshell combs for his wife's long hair. The relationship between Japan and New England was a bit like the gift of the Magi. Perry again. And here I find myself thinking back to that famous exchange of gifts between Commodore Perry and the Emperor of Japan. Perry proudly offered his gifts to the Japanese: a telegraph apparatus, rifles and revolvers, a daguerreotype camera, a miniature railroad. The Japanese presented in return some small pieces of blue and white porcelain, lacquerware, fans, seashells, dolls, a couple of dogs from the imperial kennel. I'm not sure that these are the American dogs or the Japanese dogs. You get the idea. The Americans gave modernity and the Japanese gave tradition. Perry's Americans openly scoffed at the Japanese gifts. But in retrospect, it is not at all clear who made the better bargain. In one sense, old Japan vanished at the moment of its discovery. Quote, "For old Japan was like an oyster. To open it was to kill it," as longtime resident and Japan hand Basil Chamberlain lamented. But it turned out that something of old Japan, something essential of old Japan, like the shrines carried through streets in the great Shinto festivals, something of old Japan was portable and recoverable. It could be relocated to Boston or New York or Washington, D.C., and assume a second life. President Theodore Roosevelt had a judo room in the White House, a private Japan of his own in the heart of American power. A big reason why Teddy Roosevelt was chosen to broker the Russo-Japanese War, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work, was because the Japanese trusted him. They knew that he admired Japan as a plucky little country that could overcome a stronger opponent through judo. There are incredible stories in letters of John Hay and other cabinet members of Teddy Roosevelt bringing his judo teacher into cabinet meetings to demonstrate some of the moves that he had taught the president. The recovery of old Japan was the work of men and women who realized that to open Japan culturally meant that they had to open themselves in turn and risk self-transformation in the process. For the opening of Japan occurred as much in the hearts and minds of individuals as it did in some particular location in Japan or in New England. Now, in the remainder of the talk, I want to think about what kind of people would risk such self-transformation. I believe that one aspect of such figures is that they are, for one reason or another, unmoored or cut loose from their own society. A couple of weeks ago, I had a review in the New York Times of a wonderful new book called The Daughters of the Samurai by Janice Nimura, about these three young Japanese girls who were from families that had basically lost in the Civil War, the civil disturbances in Japan. And they were taken along on the famous Okakura mission to the United States, which was basically sent to explore the possibility of renegotiating the treaties that Perry had extorted from them, exacted from them. And these three girls were sent to learn about American ways of educating women. One of the girls was 6 years old, you know. One was 12, one was 13. And the amazing thing is that they actually accomplished their mission. One of them was the first Japanese woman to get a BA at an American college. She went to Vassar. One became a very distinguished music teacher. And they went back to, and one went back to Japan and founded the greatest school for women in English language studies. Just miraculous, you know, people unmoored in their own country. But of course, when they got back to Japan, they couldn't speak Japanese. So that's part of this, the ironies involved. So as I say, what kind of people risk this kind of cross-cultural transformation? Well, one fabulous example is my hero, Edward Sylvester Morse, a man who perfectly embodies the irony that I'm describing tonight. What cut Morse loose from his American roots was religion, Christian religion. He grew up in a small town on the coast of Maine where he collected seashells, passionate seashell collector, and came of age in the narrow world of American evangelical Christianity. It felt like liberation to come under the sway of the Christianized natural science of his first mentor, Louis Agassiz of Harvard. Agassiz looked to the fossil record to prove the floods and fixed species of the biblical creation story. Darwin was the great enemy for Agassiz, and young Edward Morse was enlisted in the great battle to prove Darwin wrong. Edward Sylvester Morse worked on marine worms. Agassiz wanted Morse to show that under the microscope, there was no relation whatsoever between fossil brachiopods and living organisms in the ocean. Morse, of course, found just the opposite. It's actually a very close relation between the fossil record and the living organisms. And Morse's adoption of Darwinism had the force of a conversion. He was adrift. When Morse learned during the late 1870s that the great marine repository of sea worms was actually the coastal waters of Japan, he looked for opportunities to make the pilgrimage, and Morse was one of many visitors to the Japanese pavilions at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, where he met with officials and worked out an arrangement to teach Darwin to the Japanese. Hired to teach modern science, modern biology and zoology to the Japanese, Morse fell in love instead with traditional Japanese culture, and he collected Japanese pottery and other artifacts of old Japan to preserve them from extinction. Morse said that he developed a kind of neurasthenia. Many of the distinguished American men of the Gilded Age, like William James and so on, developed these mysterious symptoms, and their doctors suggested, a trip to the Riviera or the taking up of a hobby. And the hobby that Morse's doctor suggested was maybe he could collect Japanese things and sort of explore the side streets of Tokyo. And Morse made a wonderful comment. He said that there were only side streets in Tokyo. Still the case if you've been to Tokyo. So, as I say, Morse began to collect Japanese pottery obsessively with the idea that he was preserving these organisms from extinction, and he gave much of his collection to the MFA, like this lovely bowl. But there are hundreds of examples. There are probably thousands of examples from Morse's collection. Edward Morse looked at everything as though he was seeing it for the first time. For Morse, one thing led to another, and his curiosity recognized no bounds. He learned to eat raw the marine worms that he had come to Japan to study. Then he drew the arrangement of the worms on the serving plate and carefully noted the clay, the glaze, and the provenance of the plate itself, comparing it carefully with other similar plates he had seen. Then he examined the joints of the table on which the plate was set, the walls and the construction of the room, the house itself and its surroundings. Morse wrote a path-breaking book on Japanese domestic architecture, Japanese houses and their surroundings, which became in turn a pattern book for Japan-influenced houses all over New England. I live in Amherst, and every 20th Victorian house has these Japanese touches, eaves and other ornamental aspects of Japanese architecture that are all taken from Morse's book. Morse was one of those people, as his good friend Henry James would say, on whom nothing was lost. Hired to modernize Japan, Morse tried instead to traditionalize it. There you have it again, that ironic love affair. But the greatest ironist of all concerning Japanese-American relations, in my view, was Okakura Kakuzo, also known as Tenshin. Yeah. Okakura was, like Morse, unmoored in his own society. His father was born a samurai, but was determined that his son would be equipped for a westernized Japan. Okakura was enrolled in James Hepburn's missionary school in Yokohama. Hepburn translated the Bible into Japanese. And Okakura learned perfect English. He also learned how to sing Methodist hymns. What he forgot, however, was Japanese. His father was appalled to learn that his gifted young son could not read the signs on the streets, and he promptly moved him to a Buddhist school instead. So at the Buddhist school, Okakura learned to write with brush and ink and to play the koto. I love the idea of mastering the Methodist hymns and the koto. Okakura then became the art historian Ernest Fenollosa's favorite student at Tokyo Imperial University and was assigned the mission of modernizing Japan's art schools and museums along Western lines. What Okakura discovered during his months in the United States was that Japan owed her prestige to her traditional arts. So he became, like Morse, a preservationist. This is a wonderful statue of Okakura in traditional hermit garb. Okakura became, like Morse, a preservationist and a living embodiment of old Japan here in Boston. He served as a curator here at the Museum of Fine Arts 100 years ago. Isabella Gardner, around the corner, who collected everything, collected Okakura as well. She showed him off in full kimono in her box at Symphony Hall. Isabella Gardner hosted a tea ceremony by candlelight at midnight, performed by Okakura in her villa here on the Fenway. In his cult masterpiece, The Book of Tea, written in magnificent and eloquent English, Okakura wrote of the tea ceremony as a rite of national independence performed by samurai. He compared it to the Boston Tea Party, the great Boston tea ceremony. This reminds me of another bad moment with my editor. My first working title for The Great Wave was The Boston Tea Party of Okakura Kakuzo. And my editor said, "That's the worst book title I've ever seen." I still think of that as somehow the true title of the book. Okakura was even an ironist in the language of clothing. Okakura's theatrical practice of wearing only Japanese clothing in the West, counter to the Meiji practice of adopting Western formal attire, attracted much notice from an admiring press. Okakura once remarked that unless one's English was flawless, as his was, one should wear Western clothes in the West. If your English was good, you could wear kimono. I think this is a principle to be applied to all kinds of things in life. And I want to close with an anecdote testifying to Okakura's habitual irony and to his dexterity with English as recorded from his Boston sojourn in 1904. This story also shows his sensitivity regarding racial stereotypes of Asians as mere copyists of the West, of monkey-like copyists. So, this is the story. Okakura and a couple of Japanese companions in kimono were walking in Boston, minding their own business. They were stopped by a wag in the street who asked, "What sort of knees are you people? Are you Chinese, or Japanese, or Javanese?" Okakura calmly responded, "We are Japanese gentlemen, but what sort of key are you? Are you a Yankee, or a donkey, or a monkey?" Thank you. So I'm happy to take a few questions.
There's a
Justine
wireless mic here. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you.
Was there some sort of a scandal that brought Okakura here, or why did he come here in the first place?
It's my favorite word in book titles, scandal. So why did Okakura come here in the first place? Was there some sort of scandal attached to him? So I did rashly suggest some possible reasons in my book for Okakura's departure from Japan, where he was a very highly placed figure in the Ministry of Education, was running the major art school in Japan, was running the National Museum in Japan. I imagine that there were three possible reasons why, maybe a fourth, why Okakura was drawn to a job at the MFA in Boston. One should not think that too many reasons are necessary to take a job here. I mean, it's, you know. But Okakura was, on his first trip to America, was called to Washington, where the minister, Kuki, essentially the Japanese ambassador in the United States, had a homesick wife. And Kuki was a close friend of Henry Adams, who I mentioned before. They would sit and play Go, or Japanese chess, as Adams called it, together. Mrs. Kuki was homesick. She had been, in fact, a geisha in the pleasure quarters in Kyoto, and wanted to go home. And Kuki, this sounds like a plot out of the Rosencavalier or something, asked Okakura to accompany her home. And of course, they fell madly in love on the long Pacific crossing, and evidently had an affair that was known to people, but was nonetheless scandalous. And it's quite possible that a child born to this affair, Kuki Shuzo, is that his name, who became one of the leading philosophers of the 20th century in Japan, it's possible that he was in fact the love child of this Pacific crossing. This is the kind of thing that an American scholar rashly puts into a book, but the Japanese are much more restrained about it. It's rumored that they did live and sin together in Tokyo, that they drank a lot, that Okakura became a sort of outsider figure in the establishment. But I think also Okakura had always been a divided figure. He had always had this American westernized side to him. He never felt comfortable writing calligraphy, for example, and he developed a very eccentric style to cover up his lack of finesse with the brush, and he loved adulation. And Boston was made for a man like Okakura, and Isabella Stewart Gardner was made for him as well. I mean, she really fell madly in love with Okakura, and he knew just how much to give her to keep her coming back. And she, so when Okakura died, primarily of alcoholism, she established a shrine in her museum with the appropriate Buddhist statues and so on, and you can still see some of those at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I mean, what's so interesting with all of these Boston figures is that their interest in Italian Renaissance painting went hand in hand with their interest in this kind of esoteric Buddhist painting. Anyways, that's the short answer to your question. Yeah, there was a scandal.
Tell us a little bit about Sturgis Bigelow, or Sturgis Big, as I think you have Roosevelt referring
yes.
to him, amongst this crew of the unmoored and they wanting to become
yes.
unmoored.
Yes, so the question is about William Sturgis Bigelow. If you go to the Hokusai exhibition, and I hope you will, you'll see that roughly 80% of the works on view came through Sturgis Bigelow's generosity, his connoisseurship, and his considerable money. His father was a very distinguished doctor in Boston. I think pioneered the use of ether in childbirth. Can somebody tell me that's wrong? And young Sturgis Bigelow also wanted to be a doctor. He studied with Pasteur in Paris. He was the favorite cousin of Henry Adams's wife. These are all very closely related people, and it was partly Bigelow who persuaded Henry Adams to go to Japan himself, to go on a collecting foray. Bigelow also had one of these sort of neurasthenic, melancholy malaises, went to Washington. One can speculate on his sexual proclivities. Probably the safest thing to say is that he was not interested in marriage, was very interested in esoteric Buddhism, helped fund some of the teaching of Buddhism at Harvard, and then people like T.S. Eliot studied Buddhism at Harvard, and Buddhism entered the wasteland, and so on. Bigelow was part. He had the money to float some of his obsessions with, for example, with Japanese samurai traditions, incredible collections of Japanese swords, what are they called? Inro? What are the little sword slots? These incredible. Tsuba, yes, Tsuba. Sorry, and Netsuke, and all of the things associated with samurai lore, but very much another displaced American. All of the training of modernity, the latest science, the latest medical methods, and what he really wants to make sense of is those Hokusai waterfalls. Like that's the real. I don't know. You probably know more about him than I do. I think we're still trying to figure out who Bigelow was. I think I was the first person to say in print that he was, in the New York Review of Books, that he was homosexual. And I remember Ann Morse saying, "Ooh," that created quite a stir at the MFA. Not because they didn't know. We're Bostonians after all.
The group of Bostonian Japanophiles, Demon Ross and Bigelow and Morse and Fenollosa, how unique were they? Are there any parallels elsewhere in the United States at that time?
So the question is, how unique were the Japanophiles of New England? There were certainly clusters of Japanophiles elsewhere. Frank Lloyd Wright belonged to one such cluster in Chicago. There were slightly later clusters in California. I think what makes the Boston cluster so peculiar and so affecting is how different their Japan was from the sort of floating world, the sort of world evoked in Van Gogh's paintings, where there's a Japanese. The idea that Japan is the place of sensual delight and pleasure and so on. These were Boston Brahmins. They felt that their Puritan world was coming to an end. They felt a spiritual echo in a stern samurai world that was also coming to an end. And there's something movingly elegiac and melancholy among these Boston Japanophiles. If you look at the taste for Japan at the pavilions at the Chicago World's Fair, for example, in 1894, or the Japanese pavilions in St. Louis in 1904, the Meet Me in St. Louis, Judy Garland thing. It's a very ornate Japan. It's sort of the Japan of Nikko and red paint and a kind of a glitzy import Japan. And this world of the ones you mentioned, Bigelow and Fenollosa and Okakura and so on, is a world fit for Cotton Mather.
Thank you. Aside from this collection of rather renegade-sounding individuals, I'm wondering if there were any serious institutional attempts at cross-cultural exploration or documentation that either out of New England or elsewhere in America in the Gilded Age?
Other than...
Well, I mean, were there serious university level kinds of inquiries in terms of cross-cultural exploration or?
Do you mean specifically Japanese American relations?
Or was it pretty well left to this assortment of these rather maverick sounding individuals?
I see what you're saying. There was a great deal of scholarly curiosity about Japan. I'm groping. I mean, there was an extraordinary interest in Asian religion, for example, during this period. And one of the major endeavors at the Chicago World's Fair was a gathering of world religious scholars and Japan and Japanese religion, both Buddhism and the newer national religion of Shinto based on earlier practices, was very much a part of that discussion. Buddhist texts were beginning to be translated. The first published translations from the Sanskrit happened with, in the Dial back in this must have been in the 1840s, 1850s. Thoreau and Emerson were very interested in that. But by the 1890s, 1900, 1910, Harvard was publishing a series of Buddhist texts in translation. One of the Warren brothers, Henry Warren, was great scholar of Buddhism. So I think there was a scholarly interest in Japan alongside this, as you put it, maverick taste. But many of these scholars had their own maverick tendencies. I mean, the truth is that that cross-cultural research is often driven by eccentrics and misfits, and the more we learn about Claude Lévi-Strauss or Margaret Mead or any of the other great cultural interpreters, the more eccentric they seem to us, because they are literally eccentric. They're literally standing outside their national traditions. That's a very garbled answer to a very sophisticated question.
We have been acquiring copies of your paperback. We now have quite a pile of them. I wondered.
I'm glad to hear that. I hope you're buying them new.
Yes, absolutely, new, and ordered at bookstores.
There you go.
In addition to here. The question is there a hardbound, lavishly illustrated version that one could buy also for special friends?
Is there a lavishly illustrated version of The Great Wave?
Hardbound, if that's what you call it.
Yeah, we did do a nice version of it. Those you may have to buy secondhand. No, you ask a good question. I mean, the book is in part an art book, The Great Wave, but if you want a book to cost under $30, you can't do all that many illustrations. Certainly not in color. So my editor, the same editor with all of the downbeat responses, said, she said, "Chris, the illustrations will just have to be reminders." That has a sad sound. The illustrations are beautiful. Another question?
Well, with that fantastic note, let's bring it back up again, and I'll go buy the book and have Chris sign it. Thank you very much for lecturing.
Thank you.